An ambitious young surgeon, William Worrell Mayo, was in the early stages of building a medical revolution in the frontier town of Rochester, Minnesota. He had set his sights on a radical idea, a world where doctors didn't compete for patients, but collaborated for a cure. Before the advent of modern antibiotics, accurate diagnoses were very difficult to make, and surgical success was a rare and valuable commodity. But as the industry grew more complex, Mayo realized that the solitary doctor model was failing, sending the quality of patient care well below its potential value. To the elder Mayo, a devastating tornado that ripped through Rochester in 1883 was an opportunity to prove his theory. He discovered that by combining the skills of a surgeon with the expertise of a diagnostic team, he could generate results that would save thousands of lives. But there was just one problem. To convince the medical establishment to abandon their egos, he would have to build a temple of science from the ground up. To do that, he needed more than just assistance. He needed a partnership, and the elder Mayo knew precisely where to find it. Because Mayo thought this vision was a sure thing, he got his sons on board, Will and Charlie, and even a group of local nuns from the Sisters of St. Francis. He tried to raise the standards of medicine with everyone he knew. Mayo had one purpose: to have enough collective knowledge to conquer any disease that entered his door. Years later, his sons were successfully elected by the public as the premier surgeons of the West. They immediately called for a new way of practicing, proposing to other doctors a plan to pool resources and salaries to unlock medical breakthroughs. But to their surprise, many in the medical community rejected the brothers' plan. They were viewed as a bunch of radicals, disrupting the traditional fee-for-service model for their own ends. But the Mayo brothers had no interest in standing down. They were going to intimidate the skeptics into submission by providing results that no one could ignore. Will and Charlie were taught by their father to avoid concentrating too much on their own fame. But they went against that advice and immediately bought into the future of specialization. With enough control of their growing practice, they returned to the operating theater. They informed the staff that if they didn't follow the patient-first plan, they would be removed from the team. Afraid for their own reputations, the medical community caved in, agreeing to the Mayo way. And the two brothers from the Midwest walked away with a legacy that redefined modern healthcare. They would go on to dominate the medical industry for the next century. They were nicknamed the Wizards of the North. The Mayo brothers were born into a household of relentless curiosity. Their father made a comfortable living as a pioneer doctor. But when the country crashed into the turmoil of the Civil War era, the immediacy and the fear of infection brought a sense of being out of control to every family. Their father quickly figured out a way to turn the catastrophe into an opportunity for learning. He realized that since people were dying from primitive treatments, he would instead start teaching his sons the value of the microscope and the laboratory. His honest and principled way of practicing medicine left a huge mark on young Will and Charlie. To the brothers, their father was their hero, mostly because he treated them as partners from the age of 10. He had unlimited confidence in them, even when they made mistakes in the lab, and that took them a long, long way. The young brothers certainly found themselves in an unfamiliar environment, spending their childhoods in autopsy rooms rather than playgrounds. As their father was consumed by the duties of a frontier surgeon, the teenage brothers became obsessed with his craft. By the time they graduated medical school, they had earned a reputation for surgical skill that was the equivalent of decades of experience today. While initially planning to stay as small-town doctors, they were persuaded by the rising tide of patients to expand their higher purpose. They realized they could leverage their skills by getting into the business of systems. Applying the same strategy their father used, they searched for cigar butt practices, failing clinics that only they could unlock with teamwork. And soon, the world began to take notice. They were determined to build an empire that was unlike anyone had ever imagined, and they knew they couldn't go at it alone. By the turn of the century, the Mayo Clinic was no longer just a local hospital. It was becoming an international medical mecca. While the brothers' surgical approach had made them a fortune, it still had flaws, and their growing roster of partners knew it. It was perfectly obvious that they had made so much money in the private practice model that it was hard for them to leave something that worked so well. But it was not going to scale. To make above-average returns on their clinical excellence, they needed an edge, one that other hospitals didn't have. They soon found the perfect opportunity in the burgeoning field of medical tourism. Rochester was a small town, but it was becoming a destination for the world's elite. To build a brand that could survive beyond their own lifetimes, they did the unthinkable. In 1919, at the height of their success, the Mayo brothers dissolved their private partnership and transferred their entire fortune, millions of dollars in property and capital, into a nonprofit foundation. They traded their ownership for the security of a public trust, ensuring the clinic would be led by physicians, not shareholders. Applying the same investment in reputation that they had learned from their father, they began to target the global market. They used word of mouth as their primary newsletter, packed with crisp insights and high-hitting surgical analysis that made them the most trusted name in medicine. By the 1920s, over 60,000 people were traveling to Rochester every year, a number that dwarfed the town's actual population. They weren't just selling surgery. They were selling a standard of care that was unheard of in the noisy world of 20th century medicine. But their stubborn persistence to remain in a remote Minnesota town was about to get them in trouble yet again, as the Great Depression loomed. To Will and Charlie, the economic crash looked like another hollow victory. They owned a world-class institution, but their patients could no longer afford the trip. One of the reasons they were successful was that they were brutal in appraising their own past failures. They realized they had to adapt or become extinct. They shifted focus, building out the world's first integrated medical record system to increase efficiency. They fired up new research labs and academic programs, turning their cigar butt of a declining patient base into a powerhouse of medical education. But as the brothers entered the sunset of their lives, a new threat emerged. One that wasn't a disease or a financial crash, but the very human struggle for succession. Will and Charlie had built a machine that relied on their personal brilliance, but they knew that for the clinic to survive another century, they had to solve the founder's trap. They watched as other great surgeons of their era saw their clinics die with them, their legacies scattered like dust in the wind. To prevent this, the brothers spent their final decade obsessing over the psychology of leadership. They didn't want a successor who was an imitator. They wanted a system that was self-correcting. They began to implement a mandatory retirement age for themselves and every other doctor at the clinic, an unheard of move for surgeons at the peak of their power. Many of their peers thought they were crazy to step away from the scalpel while their hands were still steady. But the Mayos understood the long game. They realized that if the clinic didn't learn to breathe without them, it would suffocate the moment they were gone. This was their final, greatest cigar butt investment, trading their current relevance for the eternal life of their institution. The transition wasn't without its casualties. Many legendary surgeons, accustomed to being the gods of the operating room, couldn't handle the humility of the Mayo system. They left in a huff, starting rival practices that eventually withered away. But the brothers stood firm. They were building a cooperative of excellence, where the patient's name was the only one that mattered. By the time 1939 rolled around, both brothers were nearing the end of their journey. In a twist of fate that felt scripted by the universe itself, the two inseparable brothers died within months of each other. The world held its breath. Skeptics on Wall Street and in the halls of Harvard predicted that without the wizards of the North, Rochester would revert to being a quiet farming town. But the system the brothers had built, the Mayo machine, didn't skip a beat. The integrated records, the salary-based model that removed the incentive for unnecessary surgeries, and the culture of total transparency kept the clinic moving forward. They had successfully turned a family business into a global infrastructure, a feat that few entrepreneurs in any industry have ever replicated. During the Second World War, the Mayo Clinic became the strategic brain of American military medicine. While other hospitals were struggling to manage the influx of wounded soldiers, the Mayo system's ability to process massive amounts of data and specialize at scale allowed them to innovate at the speed of war. They developed high-altitude oxygen masks for pilots and pioneered new ways to treat battlefield shock, innovations that saved thousands of lives and solidified the clinic's status as a national asset. The brothers' decision to invest in systems over superstars had paid off in a way they could have never predicted. As the clinic matured into a global titan, the brothers' influence extended beyond the walls of their hospital. They were the first to recognize that the future of medicine lay in the intersection of engineering and biology. They invested heavily in the latest technology, from early X-ray machines to primitive heart-lung bypass systems, always looking for that marginal gain that could mean the difference between life and death. They treated the hospital not as a static building, but as a living, breathing laboratory that was constantly evolving. But perhaps their most enduring contribution was the way they managed the human element of medicine. They realized that a doctor who was burnt out or financially stressed could not provide the level of care their patients deserved. By providing a stable salary and a collaborative environment, they freed their physicians to focus entirely on the science of healing. They created a culture where it was okay to say, "I don't know," and ask for help from a colleague. This intellectual humility became the secret sauce of the Mayo Clinic, the very thing that made it so difficult for other institutions to replicate. Even in their private lives, the brothers were models of the values they preached. They lived modestly, pouring their excess wealth back into the community and the clinic. They were often seen walking the streets of Rochester, greeting their neighbors and checking in on former patients. They understood that their reputation was their most valuable asset, and they guarded it with a ferocity that was balanced by their genuine kindness. They were the ultimate servant leaders, long before the term became a corporate buzzword. By the 1950s, the clinic faced its next great hurdle. The world was changing, and the wizards were no longer there to steer the ship. But because they had anchored the institution in a non-profit foundation, the mission remained unshakable. While other private clinics were chasing the highest-paying plastic surgery patients, Mayo was doubling down on the lost causes. They were the first to implement a unified staff model that rewarded research and teaching as much as it did patient volume. To them, a doctor's worth wasn't measured by the money they brought in, but by the knowledge they shared. This commitment to sharing knowledge was most evident in their publishing arm. The Mayo Clinic Proceedings became a lighthouse for doctors in rural areas who had no access to the latest research. The brothers had always believed that a discovery made in Rochester was useless if it didn't help a child in rural Africa or a veteran in New York. They were the original proponents of open-source medicine, proving that you could be a global leader while giving away your most valuable secrets for free. In the 1960s, the clinic's reputation for honesty was put to the test. As the tobacco industry began its massive disinformation campaign, the Mayo Clinic was one of the first to stand up and speak the truth. They didn't care about the political fallout or the loss of wealthy donors who sat on the boards of cigarette companies. They cared about the data. This integrity, forged in the fires of their father's principled frontier practice, became the clinic's ultimate shield. Patients knew that if a Mayo doctor told them something, it was backed by the most rigorous science on the planet. As the late 20th century saw a massive consolidation of the healthcare industry, the Mayo Clinic's independence became its greatest competitive advantage. While others were cutting corners to meet quarterly earnings reports, Mayo was investing in the next 30 years. They built massive underground tunnels to connect their buildings, ensuring that Rochester's brutal winters would never stop a patient from getting to their appointment. They invested in art, in music, and in the healing architecture of their lobbies, understanding that a patient's environment was as important as their medication. Today, as we stand on the threshold of a new era in medicine, the Mayo brothers' legacy is more relevant than ever. In a world that is increasingly fragmented and polarized, their model of radical collaboration offers a path forward. They showed us that when we put aside our egos and work together for a common goal, there is no problem we cannot solve. They showed us that the true measure of a person's life is not what they accumulate, but what they give away. As we look at the landscape of modern healthcare in 2026, the Mayo story remains the ultimate blueprint for activist altruism.
They proved that you could be ruthlessly efficient and deeply compassionate at the same time. They showed that by giving away their fortune, they gained an influence that money could never buy. The brothers started with nothing but a microscope and a father's dream in a town ravaged by a tornado. They ended by creating a model of collaboration that continues to serve as the North Star for healthcare systems in the world. In the end, the Mayo brothers won the fight against obsolescence. They had defeated the traditional ego-driven model of medicine and built a legacy that was under their control and the control of the patients they served. They had learned their lesson that the only permanent way to prosperity was a balanced budget of innovation and altruism. They had joined forces with the future, and in doing so, they had left a mark on history that would last for the next 100 years. But the story doesn't end in 1939. The true untold history lies in how the clinic navigated the turbulent waters of the late 20th century. While other medical institutions were being swallowed up by massive corporate conglomerates, the Mayo Clinic remained fiercely independent. They resisted the urge to expand too quickly, focusing instead on deepening their expertise in the most complex medical cases. They became the court of last resort for patients who had been told elsewhere that there was no hope. This focus on the difficult and the desperate required a level of financial discipline that was almost unheard of in the medical world. They had to be just as savvy with their endowment as they were with their scalpels. They applied the principles of long-term thinking to their research budget, looking for high-impact projects that others had overlooked. They were the first to invest in genomics, in personalized medicine, and in the use of artificial intelligence to diagnose rare diseases. They were always looking for the next cigar butt of medical knowledge, the overlooked breakthrough that could change the world. As the digital age dawned, the clinic faced a new set of challenges. How do you maintain the personal touch of a small-town doctor in an era of telemedicine and big data? The answer, as always, lay in the brothers' original vision, the Mayo way. They used technology not to replace the doctor-patient relationship, but to enhance it. They developed tools that allowed their physicians to spend more time listening to their patients and less time filling out paperwork. They realized that the most powerful diagnostic tool was still a doctor who truly cared. The Mayo brothers were not just doctors, they were architects of a new human consciousness. They envisioned a world where health wasn't a commodity to be traded, but a right to be protected. They saw their clinic not as a business, but as a living testament to what humanity can achieve when we stop fighting each other and start fighting for each other. Their untold history isn't found in a textbook or a museum, but in the heartbeats of the millions of people who have walked through their doors and found a second chance at life. As the music fades and the lights of the clinic in Rochester continue to burn through the Minnesota night, the message of the wizards remains clear. When you put the patient first, the rest of the world follows. The brothers may be gone, but their spirit lives on in every doctor who takes the time to listen, in every researcher who refuses to give up, and in every patient who finds hope where there was none before. This is the history of the Mayo brothers, a story of two men who changed the world, one patient at a time.